A woman I'd never met marched onto my property, pointed at my fishing pole, and told me I was violating the aesthetic harmony of the lake. That was the moment I met Selena Thornfield, HOA president, full-time menace, and self-declared queen of the neighborhood. I was just trying to camp with my dog Rusty by the lake my grandfather left me, but apparently fresh air and peace are now crimes against suburban civilization. Then she called the cops on me. Yay, on my own land. What happened next turned into the kind of neighborhood drama you normally need popcorn for. Drop a comment if your HOA's ever gone rogue. I need to know I'm not the only one living in a sitcom. My name is Adam Matthews, and I own a 200-acre ranch in East Texas that's been in my family for 3 generations. The lake is clear, bordered by oak trees my grandfather planted. Rusty and I share this place every weekend. And this isn't just water and fish to me. It's home, it's peace, it's everything my family worked for over the decades. About 6 months ago, a new housing development called Pinewood Estates started going up next to my property. The houses were decent looking, probably running around $300,000 to $400,000 each, which meant the kind of people who lived there would likely mind their own business. I was wrong about that last part. The Homeowners Association elected a woman named Selena Thornfield as their president, and she had very different ideas about what constituted her business. It was a Saturday morning in early October, and I was sitting in my folding chair by the water's edge, fishing rod in hand, when I heard footsteps coming through the grass behind me. Rusty's ears perked up and he let out a low growl, which was unusual for him since he's normally friendly with strangers. I turned around to see a woman in her late 30s approaching, wearing a crisp business suit, despite it being the weekend. She walked like she owned the place, and the expression on her face suggested she wasn't here for a friendly neighbor chat. "Excuse me," she called out in a voice that was sweet on the surface but had something sharp underneath. "I'm Selena Thornfield, president of the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association. I need to speak with you about your camping activities." I set down my fishing rod and stood up, Rusty moving to stand beside me, still eyeing her warily. "Well, hello there, Miss Thornfield," I replied, trying to keep things polite. "I'm Adam Matthews, and this is my dog Rusty. What can I do for you?" She looked around at my setup, taking in the small tent, the folding chairs, the cooler, and the fishing gear, with an expression that suggested she'd just discovered something offensive. "Mr. Matthews, your camping activities here are creating quite an eyesore for our community. Our residents have invested significant money in their homes, and they have a right to expect certain standards in the neighborhood. This camping situation is not in keeping with those standards." I felt my eyebrows go up at that. I looked around at my peaceful little campsite, then back at her. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is my property. It's been in my family since 1947, long before your development was even a thought. I'm not doing anything illegal or harmful here, just enjoying my own land." Selena's smile got tighter, and I caught a glimpse of something calculating in her eyes. "Oh, I understand you believe this is your property, Mr. Matthews, but you might want to double-check that. Lake access in Texas can be quite complicated, and there are community interests to consider. My husband's construction company, Thornfield Development, has done extensive research on land use in this area, and we're very interested in helping the community develop this beautiful lake area properly. Perhaps we could discuss ways for you to cooperate with the neighborhood's vision for this space." The way she said cooperate made it sound less like a suggestion and more like a demand. I felt Rusty tense beside me, and I reached down to pat his head, as much to calm myself as to calm him. "Miss Thornfield, I'm not sure where you're getting your information, but I've got clear title to this land. The lake is completely within my property boundaries, and I've been paying taxes on it for years." Her mask slipped just a little bit then, and I saw something cold flash across her face before the fake smile returned. "Mr. Matthews, I don't think you understand the situation. We have an entire community of influential people who are very concerned about this issue. Surely you don't want the whole neighborhood working against you. I have ways of making things much more difficult if you're not willing to be reasonable. Think about property values, think about county inspections, think about all the ways a stubborn attitude can backfire on someone who isn't careful." The threat was barely veiled, and I felt my temper start to rise. Rusty must have sensed it because he let out another low growl. I kept my voice level, but there was steel in it now. "Miss Thornfield, I think this conversation is over. This is my land, and I'll use it as I see fit within the law. If you have a legal issue with that, you're welcome to contact your attorney. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave my property." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head. Then she smiled again, but this time it was the kind of smile a shark might give before it bites. "Very well, Mr. Matthews, but you really should reconsider. Sometimes the smart thing to do is to work with your neighbors instead of against them. I'm sure we'll be speaking again soon." With that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the ground with sharp, angry little sound. Rusty watched her go, his tail still and his ears alert, and I had the distinct feeling that he had better instincts about people than I did. As I watched Selena disappear back toward the housing development, I thought she was just a difficult neighbor who'd gotten used to pushing people around. But a few days later, when I saw the no trespassing sign that had been posted on my own land, I realized she wasn't just difficult. She had declared war. Seeing that no trespassing sign on my own land, with Rusty barking furiously beside me, I knew Selena was more dangerous than just a difficult neighbor. Rusty stopped dead in his tracks, head raised high, his eyes locked onto that no trespassing sign, like he was staring at a declaration of war. The scent of damp earth, the air of what should have been a peaceful day, suddenly felt heavy, like something was pressing down on my chest. I saw the sign, and it hit me. This was the start of something much bigger. The sign was planted right next to the lake, with smaller print underneath that read, "By order of Pinewood Estates, HOA." Rusty started barking before I even had time to process what I was seeing. That's when I heard the sound of an approaching golf cart echoing from the distance, the noise growing clearer with each passing second, and I knew that my peaceful morning was about to get a lot more complicated. I could hear the golf cart engine getting closer, each deliberate step of Selena and the two security guards following behind. It seemed like everyone knew they were playing a dangerous game. Selena appeared with two security guards, and I knew this wasn't a simple neighborly visit. The men were clearly private security, wearing matching black polo shirts with Pinewood Security embroidered on the chest, and they looked like they spent their free time at the gym. All three of them got out with coordinated movement that suggested this wasn't their first rodeo. Selena looked at me, her mouth forming a mocking smile, her eyes like razor blades ready to cut into my weakness. "Mr. Matthews," Selena called out in that sickeningly sweet voice, "I see you're tampering with community property. I'm going to have to ask you to step away from that sign and leave this area immediately." Rusty was barking furiously now, sensing the tension in the air, and I had to tell him to sit and stay to keep him from charging toward the newcomers. "Community property?" I repeated, holding up the sign so she could see it clearly. "Selena, this is my land. You have no right to put up signs here, and you certainly have no right to bring security guards onto my property without permission." One of the security guards stepped forward and crossed his arms, his hand clenching tighter as if preparing to spring into action. "You can't do this," one of the security guards said, his fist tightening as if ready to leap into action. "Miss Thornfield has given clear instructions. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Selena stood behind them, her smile like a knife cutting into me. I pulled out the folded copy of my property deed that I'd started carrying after Selena's first visit and held it up. "This document says otherwise. This is private property and you're all trespassing. I'm asking you politely to leave." The second security guard laughed, a sound that had no humor in it whatsoever. "Sir, we don't recognize that document. We only take orders from Miss Thornfield." That's when I realized this wasn't just about a pushy neighbor anymore. This was organized, planned, and deliberate. Selena had brought muscle to intimidate me, and she clearly expected me to back down without a fight. I looked back at the sign, then at the two security guards standing in front of me, their cold eyes and obvious demeanor showing they had been given orders. Each piece of the plan was slowly fitting together in my head. This wasn't normal. They weren't here just to warn me. They were here to force me to give up. I looked at the three of them standing there like they owned the place, then at Rusty, who was still sitting but trembling with the effort of staying in place, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "You know what?" I said, folding up my deed and putting it back in my pocket. "I think I'll let the proper authorities sort this out." I turned and started walking back toward my house, Rusty falling into step beside me, and I could hear them talking quietly behind me. When I got to my truck, I looked back and saw them still standing by the lake, the security guards taking pictures of my campsite with their phones, while Selena watched with obvious satisfaction. That evening, I found an official-looking letter from the Pinewood Estates HOA in my mailbox. The letter was typed on expensive letterhead and signed by Selena in her capacity as HOA president. It informed me that I was in violation of community standards by conducting unauthorized recreational activities on disputed property, and that I needed to cease and desist all camping, fishing, and related activities in the lake area immediately. The letter went on to say that failure to comply would result in appropriate legal action, and that the HOA was prepared to take all necessary steps to protect the interests of the community. What really got my attention was the final paragraph, which mentioned that the HOA had retained the services of a local law firm and was prepared to seek injunctive relief if I didn't cooperate voluntarily. I read the letter 3 times, each time feeling my anger grow a little hotter. Then I did what any reasonable person would do in my situation. I got on my phone and started researching Selena Thornfield and her husband's construction company. What I found made everything click into place. Thornfield Development had a pattern of acquiring lakefront property at below market prices, often after the previous owners had been pressured by various means to sell. I found records of 2 similar situations in nearby counties where the company had purchased land after the owners complained about harassment from local HOAs. In one case, a retired couple had sold their waterfront cabin for less than half its appraised value after being subjected to months of complaints, citations, and legal threats. In another case, a young family had given up their dream home after the local HOA made their lives miserable with constant violations and fees. The pattern was always the same: identify desirable property, use HOA pressure to make the owners' lives difficult, then swoop in with a low-ball offer when they were desperate to escape. Looking at the lake from my kitchen window, with Rusty lying at my feet and his ears still twitching with alertness, I knew Selena was playing a much bigger game than I had initially realized. That night, I opened my laptop and decided it was time to learn everything I could about her playbook. When I learned the truth about Selena's scheme, I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just neighborhood drama. This was a calculated conspiracy. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse with Rusty riding shotgun, determined to dig deeper into the public records and understand exactly what I was up against. The courthouse is one of those old stone buildings that's been serving East Texas since the early 1900s. The clerk in the property records office was a friendly woman in her 60s who showed me how to access the database of property transfers, tax records, and legal filings, and then left me alone with a stack of printouts and a computer terminal. Rusty curled up under the desk while I started digging through decades of documents, looking for patterns that might explain Selena's confidence in her aggressive tactics. I flipped through page after page, a cold chill running down my spine. This wasn't just paperwork from a normal land dispute. She had orchestrated an entire system to steal people's property. Selena wasn't just your average scammer. What I found was even worse than I had imagined. Over the past 5 years, Thornfield Development had acquired 7 properties in 3 different counties, all of them waterfront or near water land, and all of them purchased for significantly less than their assessed value. The pattern was consistent and sophisticated. Selena would move into a neighborhood, get herself elected to the HOA board or appointed to a position of authority, and then begin a systematic campaign of harassment against targeted property owners. She would use noise complaints, aesthetic violations, zoning challenges, and every other tool in the HOA arsenal to make life miserable for people whose land she wanted. The harassment would continue until the property owners either sold to Thornfield Development or moved away and let the company buy the land at tax auction. In most cases, the victims never realized they were being specifically targeted as part of a larger scheme. But the most disturbing discovery was a legal filing from 2 years ago in the next county over. A man named Robert Jackson had tried to fight back against similar tactics from Selena's HOA, and he had actually won the initial court case, proving that the HOA's actions constituted harassment and that their claims about his property were false. I sat down, staring at the newly discovered documents. A lawsuit had been won, but the price paid was too high. That family had gone bankrupt just for daring to fight her. It felt like I was reading about myself, about my future, if I didn't act immediately. But the legal victory had been Pyrrhic, because the cost of defending himself had forced him to take out a second mortgage on his property, and when Thornfield Development offered to buy his land for just enough to pay off his debts, he had no choice but to accept. The court records showed that Jackson had tried to sue for damages, but Selena and her husband had buried him in countersuits and legal motions until he ran out of money to fight. Reading through Jackson's deposition was like looking into a crystal ball of my own future, if I wasn't careful. I spent the day uncovering Selena's pattern of harassment, and by nightfall, I knew how she operated. The paperwork also revealed something else interesting. Selena had been sued successfully once before. 3 years ago by a property owner who had managed to prove that she had made false statements to law enforcement about his activities on his own land. The case had been settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, but the legal filing included some interesting details about Selina's methods. According to the plaintiff's attorney, Selina had a habit of calling the police with complaints that were technically true but misleadingly presented, creating situations where property owners found themselves dealing with law enforcement even when they were doing nothing wrong. She was apparently very good at walking right up to the line of what was legal without crossing it, which made her difficult to prosecute but also created a paper trail for anyone smart enough to look for it. Each detail gradually fell into place, and a cold chill ran down my spine. Selina wasn't someone who could be easily defeated. She was a skilled manipulator, and if I didn't act right now, I would become the next victim. By the time I was ready to leave, I had a manila folder full of evidence that painted a clear picture of a woman who had turned property theft into a science. Rusty seemed to sense my mood on the drive home, staying close to my leg and occasionally whining softly as if he could feel the weight of what I had learned. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Selina's confidence during our confrontations made perfect sense. She had done this before, successfully, multiple times. She knew exactly how to escalate pressure on property owners while staying just inside the bounds of the law. And she had the resources to outlast most people in a legal fight. That evening, I sat on my porch with Rusty at my feet, looking out at the lake and thinking about what my next move should be. The smart thing, the practical thing, would probably be to contact a lawyer and start building a defensive case before Selina escalated her tactics any further. But something Robert Jackson had written in his deposition stuck with me. He had mentioned that Selina's biggest weakness was her overconfidence, her belief that she could manipulate any situation to her advantage. She was so used to winning these battles that she had become careless about covering her tracks, especially when she thought she was dealing with someone who wouldn't fight back effectively. That gave me an idea. A risky idea, but one that might just turn the tables on someone who had gotten away with this scheme for far too long. But I wasn't like those people who had fallen before her. I wouldn't let her win easily. I would show her that every game can end, and this time, I would be the one controlling the game. Looking at the old legal documents, I could see that Selina wasn't invincible, and I was going to be the one to prove it. Selina thought she could pressure me with dirty tactics, but thanks to Rusty's sharp instincts, I was ready to fight back. I made my preparations and set the trap. It was only a matter of time before Selina took the bait. I contacted the county surveyor's office and arranged for an official boundary survey of my property, complete with permanent markers that would eliminate any possible confusion about where my land ended and where the HOA's authority began. The surveyor was a weathered man in his 70s named Bill, who had been marking property lines in East Texas since before I was born, and he assured me that once he was finished, there would be no question about what belonged to whom. While I was waiting for the survey to be completed, I installed a security camera system around the lake area. I bought 4 high-definition cameras with night vision capability and wireless transmission, along with a digital recording system that would store everything on a secure hard drive in my house. Installing them took me most of a weekend, with Rusty supervising the work and occasionally barking at squirrels who got too close to the equipment. I had just finished testing the camera system when Selina made her next move. On a Tuesday morning, I received a certified letter from something called the Pinewood Community Standards Board, which turned out to be another one of Selina's creations. The letter informed me that multiple residents had filed complaints about excessive noise, unsanitary conditions, and fire hazards related to my camping activities, and that I was required to appear before the board to address these violations or face appropriate enforcement action. The letter was accompanied by a stack of complaint forms, all filled out in different handwriting but with remarkably similar language, describing my peaceful camping trips as everything from disruptive late-night parties to environmental hazards threatening community safety. Reading through the complaints was almost comical, except for the fact that I knew Selina was building a paper trail to justify whatever she planned to do next. That same week, I started noticing a man in a dark SUV parked at various locations around my property, always just far enough away to avoid trespassing, but close enough to keep an eye on my activities. The first few times I saw him, I thought it might be a coincidence, but when Rusty started alerting me to his presence every morning, I realized I was being watched. The man would sit in his vehicle for hours at a time, occasionally taking pictures with a telephoto lens, and he always disappeared whenever I walked in his direction. I started documenting his surveillance activities, taking photos of his license plate, and noting the times and locations where I spotted him. One evening, as I was reviewing the footage from my new camera system, I discovered something interesting. The man had actually stepped onto my property twice to get better camera angles, not realizing that my hidden cameras were recording his trespassing. Selena's escalation continued with a letter demanding that I remove my unauthorized surveillance equipment because it allegedly violated the privacy rights of HOA residents. The letter claimed that my cameras were pointed toward the housing development and were being used to spy on the community, which was completely false, but sounded official enough to be intimidating. She also sent a copy of the letter to the county sheriff's office, along with a complaint alleging that I was engaged in suspicious surveillance activities that made the neighbors feel unsafe. I knew this was another one of her pressure tactics, designed to make me feel like I was doing something wrong even when I was well within my rights. But it was also evidence that she was getting nervous about my preparations. People who are confident in their position don't usually waste time trying to eliminate their opponent's ability to gather evidence. The final piece of Selena's pressure campaign arrived on a Friday afternoon, an official offer from Thornfield Development to purchase my property for $200,000, which was about half of what the land was actually worth. The offer letter was professionally written and included language about eliminating ongoing disputes with the community and ensuring peaceful resolution of neighborhood concerns. It also mentioned that the offer was time-sensitive and would be withdrawn if I didn't respond within 10 days. The letter was signed by David Thornfield, Selena's husband, but I recognized her manipulative language in every paragraph. This was her endgame: pressure me until I was desperate enough to sell, then swoop in with an insultingly low offer that I would have no choice but to accept. But she had made one crucial mistake in her planning. She assumed I would react the way her previous victims had reacted, with fear and confusion and a desire to make the problem go away as quickly as possible. Instead, I was getting ready to spring a trap that would expose her entire operation and give her a taste of her own medicine. That weekend, I made my final preparations, double-checking my camera system, organizing my documentation, and planning exactly how I wanted the next confrontation to unfold. Rusty seemed to sense that something big was coming because he stayed close to me all weekend, his ears alert and his eyes constantly scanning the area around the lake. On Sunday evening, I set up my tent by the water's edge, built a small campfire well within the safety regulations for outdoor burning, and settled in to wait for Selena to make her move. I knew she couldn't resist the opportunity to catch me in the act of violating her made-up rules, and this time I was going to be ready for her. The police car lights flashing in the dark, Rusty barking furiously, and Selena standing behind Officer Wilson with a smug smile. She had no idea I was about to flip the entire game. It was a crisp October evening when I deliberately set up camp by the lake, knowing full well that Selena would see it as the perfect opportunity to have me arrested and finally force me off my own property. I set up camp, preparing for Selena's next move. Rusty was lying beside the fire, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the air, and I was reading a book by the firelight when I heard the sound of vehicles approaching through the darkness. I checked my watch. 9:37 p.m., which was earlier than I had expected, but perfect for my purposes. Officer Brad Wilson's patrol car came bouncing across the field with its headlights cutting through the darkness, followed closely by Selena's white SUV. I could see her in the passenger seat, gesturing animatedly as she spoke to someone on her phone, probably calling other HOA board members to report her victory. Wilson parked about 30 feet away from my campsite and got out slowly, his hand resting on his equipment belt in the casual way that cops do when they're not sure what kind of situation they're walking into. Selena emerged from her vehicle like she was stepping onto a stage, wearing a long coat over what looked like business attire, even at this time of night. Rusty started barking as soon as he saw her, and I had to call him to sit and stay by my side. The whole scene had a theatrical quality to it, like we were all actors, playing predetermined roles in a drama that Selena thought she had already written. "Mr. Matthews," Officer Wilson called out as he approached, his flashlight beam sweeping across my campsite. "I've received reports of illegal camping and potential fire hazards on this property. I'm going to need you to explain what's going on here." I stood up slowly, keeping my hands visible and my voice calm and respectful. "Good evening, Officer Wilson. I'm camping on my own property, which is something I've been doing regularly for several years. Everything you see here is legal and safe, and I have all the necessary documentation to prove ownership." Selena stepped forward then, her voice cutting through the night air with practiced authority. "Officer Wilson, as I explained to you, this man has been repeatedly warned about his illegal activities in this community space. He's creating fire hazards, disturbing the peace, and trespassing on property that doesn't belong to him. The entire neighborhood is concerned about his behavior. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a folder containing my property deed, survey documents, and other legal papers. Officer, I'd be happy to show you my documentation. This land has been in my family since 1947, and the lake is entirely within my property boundaries. I'm not trespassing and I'm not violating any laws. Wilson took the folder and examined the documents with his flashlight, occasionally glancing up at me and then at Selena. I could see him trying to process the situation, probably wondering why he had been called out to deal with what appeared to be a civil property dispute. Selena wasn't willing to let him think too carefully about the situation. Officer Wilson, those documents are irrelevant. This is a community safety issue. This man is creating fire hazards and engaging in activities that are prohibited by neighborhood covenants. He needs to be removed from this area immediately, and if he refuses to cooperate, he should be arrested for trespassing. That's when I realized that Selena had overplayed her hand. Wilson was clearly uncomfortable with her insistence that he arrest someone on their own property, especially when I had documentation proving ownership and wasn't actually doing anything illegal. But Selena had probably used her influence with him before, and he seemed reluctant to directly contradict her version of events. Mr. Matthews, he said finally, regardless of the property ownership issues, I'm going to have to ask you to pack up and leave for tonight. This appears to be a civil matter that needs to be resolved through proper legal channels, not through law enforcement. I felt my heart sink as I realized that Selena's strategy was working exactly as she had planned. Even though I was completely within my rights, I was going to be forced off my own land because a corrupt HOA president had convinced a police officer to do her dirty work. But I also knew that this was exactly the scenario I had been preparing for. As I started to dismantle my tent, I made sure to verbalize my compliance clearly for the cameras. Officer Wilson, I want it on record that I am being forced to leave my own property despite having clear legal ownership and despite not violating any laws. I am complying with your request to avoid escalation, but I am doing so under protest. Selena was practically glowing with satisfaction as she watched me pack up my camping gear, and I could see her already planning her next move, probably involving a restraining order or an injunction that would prevent me from using my own lake. As I loaded my equipment into my truck, with Rusty jumping into the passenger seat, Selena approached Officer Wilson and spoke to him quietly, undoubtedly laying the groundwork for future harassment. The drive back to my house was only about half a mile, but it felt like the longest journey of my life. I kept looking in my rearview mirror at the lights by the lake, knowing that Selena thought she had won the war with this single battle. What she didn't know was that I had recorded every word of the conversation, documented Wilson's failure to properly investigate the property ownership issue, and captured clear evidence of her manipulative tactics. More importantly, I had confirmed that she was willing to abuse the legal system to harass property owners, which was exactly the kind of behavior that would get her into serious trouble if it were properly documented and reported to the right authorities. As I pulled into my driveway and helped Rusty out of the truck, I looked back toward the lake one more time and smiled. Selena thought she had just delivered the knockout punch, but she had actually walked right into the trap I had been setting for weeks. Tomorrow, I was going to show her what it felt like to be on the receiving end of her own tactics. Selena called the cops again, but this time Rusty and I had a trap waiting, and she was about to fall right into it. I spent the next 3 days making my final preparations, and on the following Saturday evening, I returned to the lake with everything I needed to end Selena's harassment campaign once and for all. This time, I brought official boundary markers that had been installed by the county surveyor, additional documentation from the county clerk's office proving my ownership, and most importantly, a complete recording system that would capture everything that happened from multiple angles. I also brought a folder full of evidence about Selena's previous harassment campaigns against other property owners, including the settlement documents from her earlier lawsuit and the pattern of property acquisitions by Thornfield Development. Rusty seemed to understand that this was the big moment because he stayed alert and focused, his golden fur almost glowing in the light from my camp lantern. I set up my tent in exactly the same spot as before, built my campfire with even more attention to safety regulations, and then settled in to wait. I didn't have to wait long. At exactly 9:15 p.m., I heard the familiar sound of vehicles approaching, and I knew that Selena had taken the bait. This time, however, I was ready for her. As Officer Wilson's patrol car crested the small hill, its headlights illuminating my campsite, I stood up and walked toward the official boundary marker that was now clearly visible about 20 feet from my tent. Rusty followed me, taking his position beside the marker like he understood its significance. When Wilson got out of his car, followed closely by Selena, I was standing next to the official county survey stake, with my folder of documents in my hand and a confident smile on my face. "Good evening, Officer Wilson," I called out before either of them could speak. "I'm glad you're here, because I have some important information to share with you about Miss Thornfield's harassment campaign against me and other property owners in this area." Selena's face went white when she heard that, and I could see her mind racing as she tried to figure out how to regain control of the situation. "Officer Wilson," she said quickly, "this man is still engaging in the same illegal activities I reported before. He's trespassing on community property and creating safety hazards that endanger the entire neighborhood. You need to arrest him immediately." But Wilson was looking at the boundary marker, and I could see him beginning to realize that something wasn't right about Selena's version of events. I opened my folder and pulled out the official survey documents, complete with the county seal and the surveyor's signature. "Officer Wilson, I'd like you to take a look at these official boundary markers that were installed by the county surveyor's office last week. As you can see, this survey stake marks the edge of my property, and my campsite is clearly on my side of the line. I'm not trespassing on anyone's property because this is my property." Wilson examined the documents carefully, using his flashlight to compare the legal description with the physical markers on the ground. I could see Selena getting more agitated as she realized that her claims about community property were about to be exposed as lies. "This can't be right," she insisted. "The HOA has jurisdiction over this entire area. We've been managing this lake as a community asset for months." That's when I pulled out my ace in the hole, the video evidence of her surveillance operative trespassing on my property. "Officer Wilson, I also need to report a crime that's been committed against me. Miss Thornfield hired someone to conduct surveillance on my property, and I have video evidence of that person trespassing on my land to take photographs." I handed him a tablet computer with the surveillance footage queued up, showing the man in the dark SUV clearly stepping onto my property to get better camera angles. Wilson watched the footage with increasing concern, occasionally glancing up at Selena, who was now visibly panicking. "Furthermore," I continued, "I have documentation showing that Miss Thornfield has used these same harassment tactics against other property owners in the area as part of a scheme to pressure them into selling their land to her husband's development company." Selena tried to interrupt, but Wilson held up his hand to silence her while he continued reviewing my evidence. The more he saw, the angrier he became, and I could tell that he was beginning to understand how she had manipulated him during their previous encounters. "Miss Thornfield," he said finally, his voice cold and professional, "I'm going to need you to explain why you filed false reports about the ownership of this property. Making false statements to law enforcement is a crime, and it appears that you've done it multiple times." Selena started to stammer out some excuse about misunderstanding the property boundaries, but Wilson wasn't buying it. "Ma'am, I'm also going to need you to provide information about the surveillance activities Mr. Matthews has documented, because hiring someone to trespass on private property is also illegal." I watched Selena's entire world crumble as Wilson continued his questioning, and I felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that she was finally facing consequences for her actions. Rusty seemed to sense the shift in the situation because his tail started wagging, and he looked up at me with what I swear was a proud expression on his face. "Officer Wilson," I said, "I want to file formal complaints against Miss Thornfield for harassment, filing false police reports, and conspiracy to commit trespassing. I also want to file a civil lawsuit against the HOA for their illegal interference with my property rights." Wilson nodded grimly and began taking detailed notes about everything I had shown him. As he worked, I could see Selena standing there in shock, probably realizing for the first time that her victims could fight back if they were smart enough and determined enough to gather the right evidence. By the time Wilson finished documenting everything, it was nearly midnight, and Selena looked like she had aged 10 years in the span of 2 hours. "Miss Thornfield," Wilson said as he closed his notepad, "you're going to be receiving citations for filing false reports and interfering with a police investigation. I'm also going to have to recommend that the district attorney's office review this case for possible criminal charges related to the harassment campaign Mr. Matthews has documented." As Selena walked back to her vehicle in defeat, I realized that the balance of power had shifted permanently. She was no longer the predator stalking helpless victims. She was now the one facing legal consequences for her actions, and everyone in the community would soon know exactly what kind of person she really was. $50,000 and Selena's complete downfall proved that justice isn't just sweet, it's very profitable. The wheels of justice started turning faster than I had expected after Officer Wilson filed his report with the district attorney's office. Within a week, I received a call from a prosecutor who wanted to discuss pressing criminal charges against Selena for filing false police reports and conspiracy to commit harassment. More importantly, the county attorney's office opened an investigation into the HOA's activities and discovered that they had been operating outside their legal authority for months. The official boundary survey had confirmed that the lake was entirely within my property lines, which meant that every action the HOA had taken regarding my land constituted illegal interference with private property rights. The prosecutor was particularly interested in the pattern of harassment I had documented because it suggested organized criminal activity rather than simple neighbor disputes. While the criminal case was moving forward, I also filed a civil lawsuit against both Selena personally and the Pinewood Estates HOA for harassment, trespassing, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. My attorney was a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in property rights cases, and she was fascinated by the evidence I had gathered about Thornfield Development's business model. She explained that what Selena had done was a form of legal extortion, using false claims and harassment to pressure property owners into selling below market value, and that both she and her husband could face serious financial consequences if we could prove the pattern of behavior. The attorney fees were substantial, but I knew that the potential recovery would more than cover my costs, especially if we could prove that the harassment campaign had damaged my property value. The first major break in the case came when Officer Wilson decided to cooperate fully with the investigation after realizing how badly he had been manipulated by Selena. He provided detailed testimony about her pattern of false reports and her attempts to use law enforcement as a tool for harassment. And he admitted that he should have verified her claims before taking action against me. His testimony was crucial because it established that Selena had knowingly made false statements to law enforcement, which elevated her actions from civil harassment to criminal fraud. The prosecutor offered Wilson immunity in exchange for his cooperation, and he became one of our most important witnesses in building the case against Selena and the HOA. The civil case moved even faster than the criminal case because the evidence was so overwhelming. Selena's attorney tried to argue that the whole thing was a misunderstanding and that the HOA had acted in good faith based on their interpretation of community regulations. But that defense collapsed when we presented evidence of the surveillance campaign and the pattern of similar harassment against other property owners. The smoking gun was a series of emails between Selena and her husband discussing their strategy for pressuring me to sell, including specific references to using HOA authority to make his life difficult until he gives up. When those emails were entered into evidence, Selena's attorney immediately began discussing settlement options. The settlement negotiations took about 6 weeks, during which time Selena's life became increasingly miserable as word of the lawsuit spread throughout the community. Several other property owners came forward with stories of similar harassment from the HOA, and a local newspaper picked up the story and ran a series of articles about corruption in homeowners associations. Selena was forced to resign as HOA president, and several board members demanded an audit of the organization's finances and activities. Meanwhile, Thornfield Development started facing scrutiny from other communities where they had acquired property under suspicious circumstances, and their business reputation took a serious hit. The final settlement was everything I had hoped for and more. The HOA agreed to pay me $50,000 in damages and to permanently acknowledge my exclusive ownership of the lake and surrounding property. Selena personally had to pay an additional $25,000 and sign a legal agreement prohibiting her from any future contact with me or interference with my property. Most satisfying of all, Thornfield Development was required to abandon their plans for the luxury resort they had intended to build on my land. The criminal case resulted in Selena pleading guilty to filing false police reports and receiving 2 years of probation, community service, and a permanent criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. 6 months later, I was sitting by my lake on a perfect spring evening, watching Rusty chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, when I reflected on how completely the situation had been reversed. Selena and David had quietly put their house up for sale and left Texas entirely, presumably to start over somewhere else where their reputations hadn't been destroyed. The new HOA board had reached out to me with a formal apology and an offer to establish a community agreement that would allow neighborhood residents to use the lake for recreation in exchange for a reasonable annual fee, which I agreed to because it seemed like the neighborly thing to do. Most importantly, my property values had actually increased because of the lake access and the resolution of the legal disputes. So I had turned Selena's harassment campaign into a substantial financial gain. As I sat there that evening, listening to the gentle lapping of water against the shore and watching Rusty explore the new dock I had built with part of the settlement money, I realized that the most satisfying part of the whole experience wasn't the money or even the legal victory. It was the knowledge that Selena's reign of terror over property owners in East Texas was finally over, and that her own greed and overconfidence had been the instruments of her destruction. Bullies like Selena think they can pressure anyone into submission, but sometimes they pick the wrong target and end up learning that justice, while it might take time to arrive, is always worth the wait. $50,000 in my bank account and the sight of Rusty playing freely on our dock was proof that standing up for what's right isn't just the moral thing to do, it can also be very, very profitable.
At QA Stories, we don't just